Chapter 1. Challenge accepted. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I'm sorry. The main character coughed out blood as he stared at the spear that had pierced through his chest. His vision was hazy as he gazed helplessly at a massive boar whose snort unleashed a gale, vaporizing his gushing blood. A legendary cultivator that had terrorized the Sumatra continent for more than a millennium. That was the Boar King, his enemy. You were a disappointment, Risha. Saying so, the Boar King stomped on the main character's head and splattered his brain matter all over the ground. Soundless, soulless, unable to utter a cry, the main character fell, to his demise, a death unknown to anyone, but mourned by all. The end. Author notes. To my readers, I express my gratitude. Gratitude, my ass. A youth seated in a dimly lit room roared as he flailed his hands in anger. 6 years. 6 fucking years. We supported you on this journey and you give us this pathetic ending. Fuck. I'm pissed. He crumpled a cup of ramen nearby and threw it with force, watching it splatter all over the wall upon impact. A couple of seconds later, the youth collapsed on his chair, wheezing. He had overexerted himself with that tantrum. After he graduated from university, the youth was unable to land a job, and hence, he remained unemployed. Thankfully, his parents created assets on his behalf. The rental income alone was enough for him to get by. But every time he opened social media and saw his peers succeeding in life, he became more and more depressed. In such a shut-in life, the novel, Sumatra Chronicles was his solace. The author uploaded 3 chapters a day, so it provided him ample entertainment. Since he followed it for 6 years, Sumatra Chronicles became part of his life. He wasn't even worried about it ending, for based on the lore setup, the novel should have run for another 4 years. It was a realistic novel with 0 plot armor granted to the characters, including the main character. Hence, it received a large fan following from people that were fed up with stories about main characters with gold fingers, cheats, systems, etc. The latest arc was gut-wrenchingly engaging, as every step of the way, the main character came close to death. And finally, the Boar King appeared, a villain teased for more than 2 years. He was supposed to be a villain impossible to be beaten by the main character, with death certain upon encounter. So, everyone looked forward to the clash, for until now, whenever the main character came faced with such situations, he used his wit and ingenuity to realistically survive the crisis. But faced with such hype, the author decided to kill the main character. Fuck him. Fuck. Fuckity fuck. The youth was unable to calm his rage. He slammed his keyboard and pulled up the novel's review section, intending to leave a brutally negative review. Only then would he be able to vent his frustration. The author was born when his dad boned a pig. No, it's too tame. The author's brain is infested with maggots. Damn, this isn't even insulting enough. The author fuck. No, the word fuck is banned here. Shit, can't I even come up with a decent insult? The youth grumbled. He then got an idea upon seeing the various negative reviews that were rapidly filling up the review section. Got it. He grinned excitedly as he began to type a short, but nasty review. Your mother must have been a female dog to birth a fatherless son like you. If that ending was the best you got, be hit by a truck and ice guy yourself. Even I can write a better story than yours and I'm not even literate, lol. That's a perfect insult. The youth was proud of himself. He imagined a scene where the author was roasted upon seeing his review and drowned in his tears. Ha ha ha. Fucker, what did you say about my mother? A booming voice echoed in his room, startling the youth. His monitor shone with radiance bright enough to fully light up his room as an ethereal hand of light burst out and grabbed his face. It applied pressure, forming a depression on his face, causing the youth to scream in pain. He didn't even have enough time to fully process his fear when the ethereal hand yanked him into the monitor. The monitor shut down as beeping sounds resounded from his CPU. A couple of seconds later, the PC exploded. Ah! The youth screamed as his vision was blanketed by white light. When he came to his senses, he found himself in a grayish room. The floor felt like jelly, eerie to stand upon as the sensation transmitted through his feet disgusted him. He looked at himself, noticing that his body was a mere blur. There was an indigo hue emanating from him. Suddenly, he realized he couldn't recall his name anymore, unnerved. You were saying. A muscly octopus-headed humanoid stood before him, spanning a height of 2 meters. Its arms were ripped. What did you say my mother was? At the sight of the creature, the youth's survival instinct kicked in, making him deny the accusation as his brain clocked into overdrive. I didn't say anything. That wasn't me. I was your supporter all along. I'm a good child. Enough, eat my fist. Followed by a roar, the octopus-headed humanoid pummeled the youth for a good 10 minutes. Satisfied, it snapped its finger and healed the youth, saying with a smile, your review got me thinking. Can someone clear that scenario? The octopus-headed humanoid propped up the youth and stared into his eyes to speak calmly. I was like, why not? I can rewind time and see if that's possible. You're not making any sense. The youth was flabbergasted. What are you? Where am I? What is happening to me? Why am I like this? What are you after? Relax, bud. The octopus-headed humanoid slapped him on the face once, speaking after shutting up the youth. During my journey through space, I came upon an interesting world. I was excited after observing it for a while and wanted to share the experience with others. Hence, I came to Earth and published that as a web novel. Many liked my story. But, too many hated the ending, even though, to me, it felt perfect. In that situation, there was no way Risha could survive. I mean, he faced the Boar King that was supposed to guarantee his death. And in reality, that was what happened there. Risha was killed by the Boar King. I literally wrote what had happened, but it seems not everyone likes reality. The octopus-headed humanoid's shoulder slumped in disappointment. One of its tentacles wagged like a dog's tail as it spoke, its voice one of excitement. Seeing the reviews, and observing a few challenging me at executing the story better, I thought I'll see what will happen. What are you getting at? The youth realized by now that the entity before him was the author of Sumatra Chronicles. It wasn't a human but some creature on the likes of Cthulhu. The entity seemed to talk in circles, so he was getting confused. But once he thought about the sequence of events until now, he realized what was up. It's a challenge. My God! I challenged him that I could write a better story than him. And now, he's asking me to prove it. Well, seems you got the gist. The octopus-headed humanoid nodded with a smile, capable of reading his mind. It then clapped its hand as 5 others appeared beside the youth, each emanating one of the colors that formed the rainbow. There was violet, blue, green, yellow, and orange. The youth emanated indigo. Only red was missing. The bodies of all 6 were a blur, their height, body shape, facial features, and even gender unable to be identified. Their sole identifying feature was their color. The heads of the octopus-headed humanoid multiplied by 6. It seemed each head had been conversing with a person in private, just as it happened to the youth. Once everyone had been briefed, they were brought to the same location. The 6 heads stared at the 6 people, saying in unison, I'm sending you to Sumatra continent once I rewind its time to the start of the story. Since each of you challenged me in being more capable than my main character, I dare you to show it. That's. Violet was in tears, aware of how violent and dangerous Sumatra continent was. There, death existed at every turn. Unless one was as capable as the main character, they wouldn't even know how they died. This was a story where even the main character died. So, how would average Joes like them survive in such a treacherous world? If you're scared, commit suicide once you arrive there. One of the heads of the octopus-headed humanoid stared at the youth. There's no truck there. So, you'll have to choose a painful route. Damn it, he's just mocking me. I have read Sumatra Chronicles multiple times in the past 6 years. I know the story by heart. Challenge. Bring it on. The youth snorted, you won't remove our memories of the story, right? Are you afraid we'll strip all the benefits your MC gets? He was still angry. And having been a shut-in for 6 years, he neither had a good lid on his emotions nor was he able to exercise control. As a result, he lashed out. You think my MC is that weak? In response, the octopus-headed humanoid laughed raucously, even with your knowledge of the future, you'll still fall short. As if trash like you can hold up to my MC. Don't cry when I defeat him. The person emanating a green hue snickered, you boast about Risha. But he was only that good in the second half of the story. During the first half, he was a frustrating idiot. So, be ready to accept defeat. If you manage to succeed, I'll grant you a wish. The octopus-headed humanoid said in anger, you can even be an immortal and own Earth and every living being on it. I can grant any wish. But it's game over if you were to die in Sumatra continent. I won't bother reviving a failure. C. Can you send me back home? The person with a violet hue raised their hand and asked. Nope, the octopus-headed humanoid denied with a snort, don't put on a scaredy-cat act. I know you're excited to cultivate. I know all of you are. He stared at the 6 people, among those that challenged me in the review section, I selected those that were ambitious enough to face the dangers of Sumatra and surpass my MC. I can read your thoughts and I can already see you thinking of ways to benefit yourselves. Whatever, it laughed, all 6 of you will start with the same condition as the MC. There exists only one set of treasures that you must consume to become strong and not die a premature death. You'll be competing with my MC for that. That means when I'm reincarnated there, I'll be an orphan just like Risha. And I'll also be a victim of the fragment disease. The youth thought as he looked at the 5 others next to him, there's just one cure to the disease. Only the one that gets the cure will survive the 4 major disasters. The rest are enemies. The youth concluded. The air was fraught with tension as everyone else also seemed to arrive at the same conclusion. But, there was also a strong vibe of excitement present in the expressions of everyone. All 6 of them had been bored with Earth. They wanted something beyond their mundane mortal selves in life. So, being reincarnated to a mystical world was giving them a chance to live their dreams. They could cultivate and wield supernatural powers. Hence, none of them even entertained the thought of returning to Earth. They were already daydreaming of becoming powerful by taking advantage of the countless benefits that lay on their journey. All of them knew the story by heart and were ready to take action. The youth had already begun his calculations, thankfully, Risha is a weakling at the start. So, I only need to guard against these 5. As long as I obtain the cure, I'm guaranteed to become a powerhouse. L.C. Now that everyone is on the same page, you'll be reincarnated to Sumatra. Put on your best act, as I'll be watching your journey. May you surprise me. The octopus-headed humanoid put on a solemn expression as the bodies of the 6 began to dissipate. They were being reincarnated. The youth observed his legs turning faint before they vanished, followed by his hip, then the stomach, and so on. The case was the same with the others too. Just as their heads were starting to dissipate, the octopus-headed humanoid muttered as if it had forgotten to mention, oops, there was one detail I failed to mention. The faces of all 6 people flinched in response as a sense of worry set in them. Seeing their expression, the octopus-headed humanoid let out a comically evil grin as it chuckled with a mocking tone before its voice turned solemn, this time, there's one difference from the story you read. Risha will be a regressor. Chapter 2. Sumatra continent. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Risha will be a regressor. You, bastard. All 6 faces screamed in a fluster as they vanished. Ha ha ha. The octopus-headed humanoid laughed raucously as it patted its aching stomach. Ah. That was satisfying. It's worth going through the effort to see those expressions. Now, I hope you suffer enough until you accept defeat to my MC. Sumatra Continent. Mammoth Clan, 44th Empyrean Tusk Settlement, Academy of Refinement. The youth's eyes shot open, seeing the novel world being presented as reality. There was shock, excitement, nervousness, and anticipation in his eyes. He wished to jump and announce aloud, "Young master is here." But he couldn't do that, for they were in class. The first chapter of Sumatra Chronicles starts right in the middle of class. Currently, he had 6 enemies that endangered his life in this world, and one of them was the MC, Risha. It was best to exercise caution to avoid revealing his identity. No, that was useless. As a sea of information surged into his mind, the youth's excitement cooled down. He came to understand his identity. Inala, that was his name. An orphan whose parents were supposedly reported missed in action. Worst of all, his body was weak. Cracking sounds resounded every time he tried to move. Fragment disease. 1 in every 100 people in the Mammoth clan was plagued by this incurable disease. It turned one's bones brittle. In this world where strength reigned supreme, anyone with the fragment disease was basically slapped with a death sentence. Because, any exertion of the body resulted in a fracture. Not to mention training to grow stronger, they couldn't even perform daily chores without putting their lives at risk. They were useless and a strain on the clan's resources. Usually, such people would be disposed of once they become an adult and still prove to be useless. Inala was 14 years of age now. A year later, he would be considered an adult. If he doesn't figure out a way to contribute to the clan by then, he'll be disposed off to some pranic beast as food. The Mammoth clan was a nomadic tribe that traveled on the backs of the Empyrean tusk, a pranic beast touted to be the biggest and the oldest race in Sumatra. The surface area of an Empyrean tusk's back surpassed a square kilometer. A settlement was created here where around 40,000 people lived. The Mammoth clan was situated on a herd of 44 Empyrean tusks that traversed through dangerous territories daily. Therefore, danger was ever present around them. If Inala proved to be useless, he would be heartlessly tossed into the mouth of a hungry pranic beast without hesitation. So, not only did he have to maintain caution, but also raise his value to the clan. "I'm sorry." Inala's thoughts came to a halt as he heard a murmur next to him. His body froze up in response as he slowly turned to his right and stared at a chiseled-faced boy with a handsome countenance. The boy's expression was distraught, tethering on the verge of despair as memories of his past life came surging in. Risha, the main character of Sumatra Chronicles. In the Refinement Academy, joint classes were conducted, with the youngest batch seated at the front while the oldest were at the back. Inala's group was part of the oldest batch and hence seated at the very end. As one of those affected by the fragment disease, Inala was placed in the absolute last row, nicknamed the death row. It was because, on the day they graduate, they'll be fed to a pranic beast, hence their title. Originally in the story, Risha was the sole death row student in his batch. So, he was seated alone at the back. But now, there were 7 students. That was a direct indication of their identities. Taking caution my foot. Inala masked his frustration. Among the 7 death row students, 1 was the MC while the remaining 6 were reincarnates. It was impossible to avoid a conflict since their identities were revealed right from the get-go. They were seated side by side after all. So, Risha was red. Inala thought. Based on the naming scheme, there were 7 colors in a rainbow. He was indigo. His name turned out to be Inala, sporting the first 2 letters of his color. He was also seated second in the last row as in the order. Violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. Red was Risha since he was seated last and his name had the first two letters of the color. This is a second chance. Risha came to terms with reality and stared at the class with a determined gaze. This time, I'll protect everyone. But first, who are you? He glared to his left, staring at the 6 students there. These 6 never existed in my previous life. What is happening? Did you hurt your head, Risha? The one seated closest to Risha, at the position of orange, tilted his head in confusion. Don't tell me you forgot your bestie, Oraka. Bestie. Risha frowned. Fear of death might have erased his memories. The one seated at the position of green mocked, we're the infamous death row students of this academy, after all. Not a single clansman thinks we have a future. Are you being serious, Risha? The one seated at the position of blue expressed his confusion as he gloomily stared at Risha. Have you forgotten us? Such fucking actors. Inala was awed by their performance. Since they didn't exist in Risha's previous lives, they began to act as if they were close to him now, edging him to the train of thought that maybe there existed some differences in his second life. None of them communicated with each other, but argued in such a way one might think they were friends for years. I'm scheming against people of such level. Inala was excited. Things just became more interesting. He then acted like he had been observing Risha all along and spoke in worry. I didn't know fragment disease can also affect our memories. I'm worried now. Why don't we introduce ourselves to each other? This way, we can help jog Risha's memory. Us death row students need to be united. The one seated in the position of violet spoke in support of Inala. I'm Virala. Virala for violet, Inala for indigo, Blola for blue, Greyha for green, Yenda for yellow, Oraka for orange, and finally, Risha for red. Everyone introduced themselves. The first goal of the reincarnates was to ease themselves up with the regressor to avoid being killed immediately. Thankfully, it went well. Inala sighed in relief as he observed Risha's conflicted and confused expression. But an instant later, his heart lurched upon sensing the latter's killing intent. Chapter 3. The main character expresses animosity. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Inala shuddered at the killing intent. Is this how killing intent feels like? It's terrifying, too terrifying. Am I supposed to compete with such a monster? Just as he was about to faint from the killing intent, the gears in his brain churned as he recalled Chapter 1 of Sumatra Chronicles. The story starts in the Academy of Refinement and directly plunges the readers with a scene of gore, thereby setting up the treacherous nature of the world. And the cause of that was what Risha was directing his killing intent towards. All students. To the shelter, now. The instructor's booming voice addressed the over 300 students at the Academy of Refinement. I'm not prepared. Virala clutched his head in panic. This the first minor crisis. Inala became nervous as he rushed alongside the students, following only after seeing Risha among the crowd. Sumatra Chronicles consisted of 21 minor crises and 4 major disasters, with Risha being killed in the 4th major disaster. Even though this was a minor crisis, it shouldn't be underestimated, for at the end of this event in the story, the population of their settlement was slashed in half. That spoke volumes of the danger involved. The herd of 44 Empyrean tusks form a straight line as they tread through treacherous lands. The strongest Empyrean tusk stands at the forefront of the file while the weakest is positioned at the end. Their settlement's Empyrean tusk was at 44th place, dead last. Not only was it weak, but it was also gaining in on old age. As a result, its footsteps weren't perfectly placed on the path forged by the strong Empyrean tusks at the forefront of the herd. It had set foot on a nest by mistake and crushed a portion of it. As a result, the pranic beasts part of the nest, mud vipers rushed out en masse and swarmed the 44th Empyrean tusk. They began to crawl over the Empyrean tusk's legs to reach the top and attack the settlement there, acting based on the life signatures they picked up. Pranic beasts were creatures native to Sumatra and came in all forms. Mud vipers were serpentine creatures with a pair of forelegs that allowed them to grab onto things and lurch forward. A mud viper spanned 3 meters in length when it reached maturity. Its speciality lay in spitting out mud balls that were adhesive in nature. The mud balls would harden in a matter of seconds once it spits out. Mud vipers would spit mud balls onto a target and turn them into a sculpture. They would then drag the sculptures to their nest to feast at a later date. The problem with mud vipers was that when they latch enough mud balls onto the joints of the empyrean tusk, they can prevent it from moving. Once constricted to a place, it was only a matter of time before the mud vipers overwhelm and feast upon the empyrean tusk and the people living on it. The herd of empyrean tusks was constantly on the move and would only stop at locations deemed safe by the leader. Stopping anywhere else was risky. Hence, none of the 43 empyrean tusks part of the herd stopped to assist the 44th empyrean tusk. Since Risha is a regressor, the event might change due to his involvement. But, there's no guarantee whether or not it is to my benefit. After all, this broken nest is home to at least 1 million mud vipers. Inala thought in worry. There were plenty of elites in their settlement to fight against the enemies, but the number of mud vipers was too much. No matter how strong they were, 40,000 people wouldn't fare well against 1 million mud vipers. In the story, their settlement loses half its population to the mud vipers. It was the rise to a bloody start. While moving towards the shelter meant for students, Inala felt around his body. There was a pouch hung around his hip, and in it was a rugged bone sphere. Inala sensed a faint wisp of energy in his body. He riled it up according to the memories of the body and focused it upon the rugged bone sphere, watching it twitch in response. Okay, at least I'm not completely helpless. Prana. That was the energy one cultivated on Sumatra, a fusion between the energies of soul, mind, and body. Based on the established measurement units of this world, he had 12 prana, a paltry sum for someone his age. But that was the norm for someone unable to train due to the fragment disease. Inala ran slowly to avoid fracturing his legs. Those with the fragment disease were the last to enter the shelter, a dome-shaped room carved within the bony carapace of the empyrean tusk. It only had a small entrance. Remain here. Saying so, the instructor closed the entrance and stood guard outside. 10, 9. Suddenly, Risha began a countdown. He was just muttering, but all 6 reincarnates had their attention wholly focused on him and hence noticed his action. They might know the full story, but Risha had experienced it firsthand. So, it was better to follow the regressor. 1. Saying so, Risha took out a bone sphere from his pouch and threw it slowly. He infused his prana into it and caused it to fly in the air. The shelter's entrance collapsed as the instructor came crashing in. Pressing him were a group of mud vipers, spitting mud balls on his joints to constrict him while they clawed upon his flesh. One of the mud vipers opened its mouth wide to bite off the instructor's eyes. Risha's bone sphere accurately flew into its mouth and lodged itself in its throat. Sweat covered his forehead as he focused to the limit, causing the bone sphere to rotate and crush the mud viper's windpipe, thereby suffocating it. The bone sphere thrashed about within the suffocated mud viper's mouth and killed it a few seconds later. They're here. Run. The students scattered to the corners of the shelter as more and more mud vipers entered through the broken entrance. Risha was the sole individual daring to stand out in the middle of the room. He grunted and seeped more prana into the bone sphere, causing it to soak up the mud viper's blood. Mystic bone art, toxin refinement. With a tug of his mind, Risha pulled out the bone sphere from the mud viper's mouth. He caught it and licked the refined blood coating it, exhaling in satisfaction, I can finally move my damn body a bit more seriously. Right, the refined toxins from a mud viper can temporarily suppress the fragment disease. It was what Risha used to train his prana after this event. But to refine it takes considerable skill. Otherwise, the toxin would close up one's stomach walls and kill them. He faced a lot of issues as a result. But in this life, he has more than enough skill to purely turn the toxin into a tonic. Inala analyzed. Of course, the other 5 reincarnates had the same thought. While Risha was in a reverie from the tonic's effects, Oraka rushed towards him and licked some of the blood from his bone sphere. Risha was stunned by his actions. As Oraka relished the tonic's effects, Risha slammed the bone sphere on his face, dislocating his jaw. Oraka fell to the ground, knocked unconscious. A group of mud vipers targeting Risha changed targets to the helpless Oraka. They tore off his hands to feast upon and recover some of their expended energy. It was a bloody sight. Following that, the mud vipers turned Oraka into a sculpture and transported him out. It was a signal of his end. At that moment, Risha turned around and stared at the figures of the reincarnates that had approached closer to him, having had the same thoughts as Oraka. Risha stared at their stunned faces and the spot on his bone sphere that had been licked by Oraka. None among the students at this point should have been aware of the tonic he produced. The fact that Oraka knew to accurately target it meant information about him had been compromised. Someone he had no knowledge about seemed to know everything there was to him. They didn't exist in his past life. Therefore, it could either be a side effect of his regression or a scheme by some heavenly being. In any case, their existence proved dangerous to him. The thought didn't sit well with Risha. He stared at the remaining 5 reincarnates. Dare provoke me, and you'll end up the same as that bastard. The main character expressed his animosity towards them. Chapter 4. First love interest. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A vast forest that stretched for thousands of kilometers, littered with mounds reaching as high as 200 meters. Each mound was home to a mud viper colony. The forest patch with trees reaching as high as 400 meters was treated no different to grass by the massive legs that seemed to descend from the skies. Clouds covered most of this giant's upper body. Such was its massiveness. Spanning a length of 2 kilometers, a breadth of 0.6 kilometers and its tallest point reaching a whopping height of 1.6 kilometers, it was a moving mountain. Empyrean tusk. Each of its footsteps thundered the ground, flattening large patches of the forest. A herd of Empyrean tusks was now marching through this forest, leaving behind a wasteland in their wake. There was at least a kilometer gap between 2 Empyrean tusks, as such a distance was necessary if these massive bodies wanted to arrive at a halt without colliding with each other. Every creature shuddered at the thunderous sounds they released every time they trumpeted, causing heaven and earth to rattle in response. But even these mighty creatures took great pains to waddle between the mounds, rerouting their path if the gap between the mounds was too narrow for them to pass through. Such was the danger posed by a mud viper's nest, for even a single nest contained 1,000,000 of them. If all the mud vipers in the forest region were provoked, not even the bones of the Empyrean tusk herd would remain. Hence, these mammoth creatures exercised extra alertness. But the weakest of the group, and the oldest, had a failing eyesight. And hence, it had set foot on a nest, causing the mud vipers to crawl out of it en masse and swarm the 44th Empyrean tusk. As the 44th Empyrean tusk was fighting off the mud vipers, the rest of the herd had already traveled a dozen kilometers. If it continued to delay, it would soon lose sight of the herd. Once stranded, it would be picked apart by the vicious pranic beasts that littered the territory. It was why even Empyrean tusks moved as a herd. Mud vipers continued to crawl over the 44th Empyrean tusk's legs. The cultivators of the settlement began a series of bombardments along the stomach region, swatting away thousands every few seconds. But the enemy numbers just didn't seem to stop. Many mud vipers began to reach the top as they swam like water through the grooves that traversed throughout the carapace on the Empyrean tusk's back. Defensive units of cultivators were positioned in pivotal regions, but the numbers were too much for them to handle. Some of them made their way to the Academy of Refinement, entering through the broken entrance as they swarmed the corpse of the instructor and gobbled him up. There was a lot of prana in his body. It served as valuable nutrition, better than the students with fledgling amounts of prana. Until the instructor was consumed, the students wouldn't come under direct harm. Of course, that didn't apply to the mud vipers that didn't get a share of the instructor. The situation was dire. Risha couldn't set his attention aside to focus on the reincarnates. This is a training opportunity. Using their toxins, I can quickly accumulate prana. I won't get a better chance. Risha only had 12 prana. It was a paltry sum and served no use other than to unleash some minor attacks. As long as I accumulate enough toxin, should be able to reach 40 prana by the end of this crisis. He was too weak to worry about others. Hence, raising his strength took priority. The moment Risha focused on fighting the mud viper stragglers, the reincarnates disappeared among the crowd of students. This is where Risha helps Rava. Inala thought as he observed the faces of the panic-stricken students. He was looking for a particular girl based on the description in the novel. Rava was the first love interest to Risha in Sumatra Chronicles. That ship never sailed as Rava ends up dead during the second minor crisis. But she herself wasn't that important. The focus here was her grandmother. Known as Granny Oyo among the clansmen, she was the oldest surviving cultivator affected by the fragment disease. She had plenty of knowledge regarding the disease itself. And when Risha saves Rava, Granny Oyo concocts various tonic that allowed him to increase his prana. She was an important character during the initial phase of the story and opened one of the most important routes in curing the disease. Therefore, it was apparent that the reincarnates were searching for Rava. Tender face, swan-like features, shoulder-length hair, and a tiny mole on her chin. Inala soon found the person in question. But just as he intended to approach her, he noticed her hugging Virala nervously. When did this fucker become this close with her? Inala was stunned. But once he recalled the events, he understood what had happened. When Oraka targeted Risha to lick the tonic, Blola, Greha, and Yenda were nearby. They were only a second late to act as compared to Oraka. And when Risha knocked out Oraka and caused the mud vipers to catch him, the trio were stunned. Inala hadn't moved from his original spot as he had other plans and only intended to observe Risha in action. But Virala, this acting coward, was already on the move. After locating Rava, he used his slick tongue to get her to rely upon him. At first, Inala intended to fight Virala, but he changed his mind at a second glance. No, all I would do is waste my time here. It would just seem like a scheme. Rava wouldn't trust me enough for Granny Oyo to assist me. Besides, the other three will try to approach Rava too. Change of plans then. There was more than one way to get Granny Oyo's assistance. It was something he had thought about years ago, during one of his daydreaming sessions about Sumatra Chronicles. Inala waddled through the crowd slowly as he took out the rugged bone sphere from his pouch. Once he infused his prana into it, the rugged bone sphere awkwardly floated in the air. Even though the necessary memory and experience were in his body, this was his first time, so there was a bit of awkwardness. But even that was enough as he slowly brought the rugged bone sphere to the ceiling of the room. He then positioned it to the back of a mud viper that had latched onto a student's leg. He waited patiently, for some reason grinning like a psychopath even when the student's flesh was ripped apart by the mud viper. As it gobbled up the flesh, a window of chance presented itself. Go! He brought down the bone sphere with force and slammed it on the mud viper's back, knocking it into a state of concussion and delirium. As the mud viper struggled to recover from the attack, Inala rushed towards it and grabbed its forearm. He lifted it like a water hose and twisted its arm, causing it to reflexively launch a mud ball. Success. Chapter 5. A bold, daring move. You are listening at novelfull.audio. During the latter half of Sumatra Chronicles, once Risha is cured of his disease and becomes strong, he hunts for mud vipers to collect their toxins in order to refine an elixir. When he experiments on their bodies, he discovered a weak spot on their back that was akin to a human's lower jaw. When impacted, the mud viper loses control over all motor functions for a couple of minutes. At that time, when their forelimbs are cranked up by a third party, they would instinctively shoot mud balls until they're drained of all prana. It was hard to make note of this weak spot through the novel's description alone, which was why Inala observed Risha's actions. Risha's bone sphere accurately slammed the spot, knocking the mud vipers out of commission before he targeted their insides to refine their toxin into a tonic. After seeing it a few times, Inala was able to confirm the location and hence took action. With a weak body whose brittle bones would break at the slightest exertion, this was his only way to fight. Ugh! He grunted in pain that made him wish he could curl up in a corner and give up on everything. All he did was lift the upper body of the mud viper. It felt like nails were hammered into his body as a couple of locations on his arms fractured from the exertion. Endure. 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 Inala hypnotized himself with the bright cultivation future that awaited him to endure the pain and press forward. He pointed the mouth towards the shelter's entrance and shot a mud ball. The aim was off a little as it flew through the open entrance and slammed into the face of a mud viper. He wasn't targeting the mud vipers, but the wall, intending to close the entrance. After a few failed shots, he began to stack up the mud balls around the corner of the entrance, beginning to gradually close them. But of course, one mud viper wasn't enough, especially since the mud vipers began to break apart the hardened walls to widen the gap once again. Some mud vipers had noticed his actions and crawled towards him. He hurriedly dropped the prana. Less mud viper, inhaled a deep breath, and shouted, "Greha! Come help me!" "What the? Why me?" Greha was surprised. Out of everyone, Inala called him. He had just worked together with Virala to kill a mud viper and protect Rava. His contribution to the kill paled in response to Virala. Upon seeing how most of Rava's gratitude went towards Virala, he was feeling frustrated as is. But hearing Inala's shout, he observed the situation and understood the latter's plan, grinning, "He's forging a new path, huh? Count me in." Greha rushed towards Inala and clapped his hands aloud, garnering the attention of the three mud vipers targeting the latter. "Come get me." He flinched in pain, for that loud clap seemed to have cracked his palm. He almost lost his breath when he was forced to roll on the ground and evade a couple of mud balls. Thankfully, while he distracted them, Inala dropped the bone spheres on the three mud vipers one after another. "Shoot!" Inala propped up a mud viper as his eyes were bloodshot from the fracturing pain his body experienced. He aimed at the entrance and blasted off a volley of mud balls. Greha gasped for air and panted as he lifted his mud viper and did the same. His vision spun, he couldn't feel his arms. Rolling on the ground was too much for his bones to handle. "Ugh!" Inala grunted when a mud ball slammed into his left foot, rooting him to the spot. He didn't have enough physical strength to break free. His only option was to seal the hole. Working together with Greha, they shot mud balls in quick succession, covering up the entrance. The hardened mud wall wasn't tough enough. As long as the mud vipers ram into it enough times, they would break the walls. Moreover, they also secreted a toxin that could loosen up the hardened mud wall. It was their ability, after all. Inala dropped the emptied mud viper and lifted the third one, using it to target the mud vipers approaching him. By now, a few mud balls had landed on him. His legs, torso, and left arm had been turned into a sculpture. But the hardening of his left arm meant it could bear part of the mud viper's weight that he was holding, which allowed him to aim better. His free right hand was enough. Inala and Greha were nervous, for the mud vipers continued to slither towards them. Those constricted by a mud wall took a minute to free themselves before joining the pursuit. All the students were fighting against the mud vipers. And even though the entrance had been sealed, plenty had barged into the shelter already. Soon, Inala was overwhelmed. Shit! He flinched in fright when a mud viper leaped at him. Thankfully, he aimed his rugged bone sphere on time into its mouth, choking it. His eyes darted to the mud viper in his hand. It can shoot a few more mud balls. There were too many mud vipers left. With him constricted to the spot, it was only a matter of time before he would die. His heart thumped as his eyes fell on the enclosed entrance. After a moment of hesitation, he boldly aimed the mud viper at his legs and shot mud balls in a flurry. Death is everywhere in Sumatra. If I leave things to chance, only death awaits me. Thinking as such, Inala shot the remaining mud balls on his head, saving the last for his right hand. Once he shot the last one, he dropped the mud viper, barely repositioned his arm through the mud, and felt it harden completely. With that, he had become a sculpture. Positioned before his nose was his rugged bone sphere, also covered by mud. He angled it a centimeter away from his nose. Thereby, when it was covered by the mud, there was a narrow passage open below, enough for him to breathe. But it was hidden enough that none would notice the gap until they were to look from close up. Since he had affixed himself to the floor with many layers of mud balls, it would take the mud vipers at least 10 minutes to break it free before they could transport him away. Why would they waste that much time on him when plenty of easy prey were nearby? As a wise man once said, when a bear chases you, pray not to be the fastest but faster than your running friend. That way, once the bear catches the slower friend, it would stop to eat him, giving him more than enough time to run to safety. This was precisely what Inala had done here. Chapter 6. Surviving the first minor crisis. You are listening at novelfull.audio. I can barely hear the sound. Inala was nervous, afraid even, for oftentimes, it felt like a mud viper slithered past him. The sounds of the students using their bone weapons to combat the mud vipers resounded like muffled rain as they slammed into the ground. Most of the attacks weren't fast enough to land a hit on the agile mud vipers. So, they often slammed into the floor. Strangely, even as the situation turned chaotic, Inala hadn't been targeted. This daring bastard. Greyha whistled in praise at Inala's actions. Unfortunately, he couldn't attempt that, for he only had one captured mud viper to use. And its prana had already been expended. He pinched the mouth of the mud viper in his possession, causing it to secrete a certain toxin that loosened up the hardened mud on his body, allowing him to break free after a while. He stared at the 3 mud vipers that he had taken down with Inala. After a thought, he tied up their tails into a knot. He seemed to be an expert in ropes and made a tight knot that couldn't be broken free. But if he so wished, he could undo it easily. Greyha coiled the bodies of the 3 mud vipers around him like he was braiding himself, turning into a roll. Using the same method that Risha used to suffocate the mud vipers, he ensured the 3 fell unconscious. Of course, he didn't kill them, for that would break his cover. Now as a roll of mud vipers, he rolled towards a corner of the shelter and remained there, playing dead. His body was entirely covered up by the mud vipers. And since they were alive, the other mud vipers didn't approach him. Mud vipers sensed the life force of their targets to attack. And since 3 mud vipers were on a prey, they didn't bother to join in, especially since there was still plenty of prey around. When a bear chases you, you know the drill. Greyha did the same to avoid the fight. That guy. Risha stared at the sculpture formed by Inala. Thanks to the tonic, his fragment disease was suppressed, allowing him to throw a small mud viper at the sculpture. He intended to sabotage Inala's plan. The mud viper shook its head from the impact and observed the sculpture. Judging that it was annoying to melt through the hardened mud layers alone, it slithered away to target another student. The youngest batch of students was only 10 years old, too helpless to defend against these pranic beasts. They became the easiest targets. TCH. Seeing his plan fail, Risha clicked his tongue. He lifted his bone sphere and sucked in the tonic it had accumulated thanks to his skill of toxin refinement. His prana values had already shot up to 16 now. The tonic he accumulated was enough to raise his prana to 20 units. I'm halfway there. I'll accumulate some more. Just as Risha killed another mud viper, he noticed Rava from the corner of his eye. She was being protected by Virala. It seemed by fighting together for some time, the duo had developed a decent level of trust in each other. Even though Risha didn't have any romantic interest towards Rava, at the sight of Virala deepening his relationship with her using the situation, a sense of anger and revulsion welled up in him. Virala, right. Once this ends, I'll kill you. His eyes were cold as Risha increased his killing pace. Seated in one corner of the room and drinking the blood of an unconscious mud viper was Blola. He felt a constricting sensation in his stomach due to the toxins. It felt like his stomach walls were gradually closing up. Blola didn't panic at the process. Instead, he calmly surfed through the memories of his body and activated the cultivation technique of the Mammoth clan, one of the best Sumatra had to offer. Mystic Bone Art. Mystic Bone Art speeds up one's digestion speed, thereby circulating enriched blood throughout the body. As the heart rate increases to levels an athlete would reach while on top sprint, the body's functions attain peak performance. This was no different from undergoing rigorous training as the body's fat and carbohydrate reserves are consumed rapidly. In this clocked state, the body's muscles undergo minor tears. As the prana circulates through the damaged areas, the muscles heal and are reforged stronger. This was the basic principle of Mystic Bone Art. It strengthened the body on all levels. And the core of this art lay in the digestion of the ingested food. Therefore, even though Blola ingested the mud viper's blood full of toxins, once he circulated the art, the pain in his stomach eased up. He would have died if he ingested its venom sac. Therefore, he started with the blood that had the mildest dose of toxin, intending to acclimate to it first. Moreover, as he circulated the Mystic Bone Art, his prana was gradually increasing. Prana was an energy condensed from the energies of the soul, mind, and body. Therefore, the best elixir to develop it was to drink the blood of a pranic beast while it was alive. As Blola continued to do so, he exuded a bloody smell, causing the mud vipers nearby to flee in panic, for it was a deep stench of their blood he was emanating. At that moment, he was registered as a predator in their minds. It wouldn't work if he had been alone, for even predators were food when one was hungry enough. But as there was enough prey to go around, the mud vipers didn't take the risk. Time passed in such a fashion as the 44th Empyrean tusk slowly moved on from the mud viper nest it had collapsed. Once it reached far away, the surviving mud vipers retreated, carrying with them the people they had turned into sculptures. The shelter in the Academy of Refinement was safe thanks to the entrance being blocked. As a result, the retreat signal wasn't sensed by the mud vipers within. And once the Empyrean tusk was safe, the elites rushed into the shelter and slaughtered the remaining mud vipers. I survived that. Inala sighed in relief as he inhaled large gulps of air, watching the hardened mud on him fall off. The clan had the reagents necessary to dissolve it. He collapsed to the floor in pain, for his bones had fractured in multiple places. You want to live that badly, huh? A cold voice resounded. A middle-aged man stood before Inala, emotionlessly observing the latter. A robust body akin to steel, pair of eyes that were cold enough for the onlooker to feel like they were in a blizzard, and a suffocating stench of blood that could never be washed away. At the sight of the middle-aged man, Inala trembled in fear, easily recognizing the features repeatedly stated in Sumatra Chronicles, the 44th Empyrean Tusk settlement leader. Why did this madman have to come here? Chapter 7. Extorting the Regressor. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Why did this madman have to come here? Inala became nervous to the extent he experienced a state of breathlessness. Most of it was thanks to the bloodlust released by the middle-aged man before him. Inala wasn't used to such a sight and hence felt overwhelmed both physically and mentally. The 44th settlement leader, Bora Tusk. Only the leaders of each settlement had the right to add the suffix tusk to their names. It signified their leadership status. Bora had been alive for more than 2 centuries. And during his long, bloody life, he saw too many of his clansmen die. As a result, it messed him up mentally, causing him to begin observing people as no more than meat shields with a bit of power. His craziness was only amplified by the 44th Empyrean Tusks gaining old age. If it were to die, they'll be stranded, homeless. In Sumatra, without the support of an Empyrean Tusk, a mammoth clansman would die a horrible death. Therefore, he had taken plenty of radical measures. One of them was to send away the parents of children with the fragment disease into the wilderness of Sumatra. Their mission was to find a young Empyrean Tusk for their settlement to migrate towards. And until they succeed, they were banned from returning home. They were sent on this mission on the condition that their kids would be nurtured until adulthood. Otherwise, their policy was generally to throw those with the fragment disease into the mouth of a prana beast during infancy itself. That would conserve their resources. Of course, Sumatra continent was too dangerous. Most of these parents ended up dead. In the story, Risha's parents would end up succeeding in their mission and return. It was a detail revealed way later in the story. But until that happened, the parents of those with fragment disease were labeled missing in action. Bora Tusk had severe mood swings. It wouldn't come as a surprise if he straight up killed a student when bothered. So, Inala was nervous. Sealing up the entrance using the mud balls was your doing, right? Bora Tusk stared at Inala, continuing without waiting for a response, and when you achieved your objective, you decisively turned yourself into a sculpture. That's why someone as weak as you managed to survive. Inala prostrated on the ground as a sign of respect. But he dared not say anything. Throughout the story, every time someone talked to Bora Tusk, things always took a negative turn. Therefore, remaining silent and expressing his intention through body language was the best bet. 210 students from the over 300 survived. Bora Tusk muttered as he looked around the shelter, if it hadn't been for you sealing up the entrance, more than half would have lost their lives. Originally, Bora Tusk shouldn't have arrived here. He would be busy forming an expedition team to recover as many elites captured by the Mud Vipers as possible. Students were of his least concern. After all, the amount of resources expended to nurture an elite was an exorbitant sum. It would be a loss to the settlement if an elite was killed. In contrast, a student had no value to the clan before they matured. If they died, so be it. More can be birthed. That was in line with the Mammoth clan's thought process. Only by pumping out babies en masse were they able to persevere through the insane death rate. It seems he was interested in the sealed entrance and arrived here to check things out. If I'm right, he might reward me. Inala thought, trying his best to remain calm. As I thought, you need to be rewarded. Bora Tusk said after some consideration, Sumatra doesn't follow the law of survival of the strong, but the survival of the fittest. You, he patted Inala, are fit to survive here. He brought out a box and inserted his hand through the entrance. After a while of shuffling about, he took out a vial and gave it to Inala, since you desire to increase your prana, this low grade elixir will be your reward. With your body's condition though, you can at most gain 20 prana, such a waste. With a snort, he turned around and left the shelter, his sight falling on Risha, Blola, and Greha. His lips quivered to form a mild smile. There are some brats with strong survival desires. An elixir. Inala muttered in a daze as he stared at the tiny vial. As Bora Tusk said, it was a waste in his possession. Low-grade elixir it might be, but it can raise one's prana by 100. It was a priceless treasure. But as he had the fragment disease, even if he did his utmost, it would be a wonder if he gained 20 prana. That was a waste of an elixir. Still, as it was already rewarded to him, it was his right to do whatever he pleased with it. The students flashed him with gazes of envy. For by consuming the elixir, they could graduate from the Academy of Refinement and gain the power to truly fight the dangers of Sumatra. Inala, you have a minute. Risha calmly arrived next to Inala and stood there, emanating a gentle wave of killing intent to thwart the students away. A good number of them intended to exchange the elixir for a number of resources. Only trade was a possibility. If it was stolen, the elites would know and realize the perpetrator based on the increase in their prana levels. That was why none expressed any intention to steal. There was at least that level of rules and regulations in place. Of course, he wants some benefit. Inala nodded calmly, wishing to see what proposal this resourceful regressor had. Give me half of the elixir. In return, I'll help you gain 40 prana. Risha proposed. 70 prana, Inala said calmly, otherwise, forget it. Are you shitting me? Risha expressed killing intent. Do you dare believe anyone can give you a better offer? If you consume the elixir, you'll at most get 16 prana. My offer gives you more than double that amount. If you were the Risha from yesterday, I would have been surprised and wondered how you know such a priceless method. Eventually, I would accept. But, Inala snorted, you're a completely different person today. I have been observing you fight. It seems as if you know about things I dare not fathom. What are you getting at? Risha glared in anger, is this bastard probing me? 40 prana, plus the method you used on the mud vipers. Inala said calmly, if you accept it, then we have a deal. You're ripping me off. If not for the elites still in the vicinity, Risha would have killed Inala. It took me 10 years to perfect the toxin refinement skill. This bastard wants it for merely half a low-grade elixir. Fucking. If you don't want it, then leave. Inala opened the cork and was about to down the elixir, don't interfere with the proposals of the other students. You're wasting that elixir. Risha gritted his teeth to the extent clattering sounds were audible to Inala's ears. It's mine anyway, Inala shrugged, I can dump it or spit on it, whatever I want. You're the one with the desire, not me, bastard. It was indeed true that Risha desired it the most since it would save him a lot of time in building up strength. His toxin refinement skill was powerful, but his current body was too weak to efficiently use it. Its advantages would only show during the late game period. But in this initial phase, it didn't have much value. In the end, Risha relented as he took out his bone sphere and inscribed the toxin refinement skill in it. He handed it unwillingly to Inala, wash your neck and beware. Chapter 8. Elixir Condensation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The adults were calmly moving the corpses of the mud vipers. Their attention was on Inala, more so on the elixir in his possession. It would be a lie to say they didn't desire it, for consuming an elixir gave them at least a couple of years' worth of prana accumulated through non-stop training. All elixirs were strictly managed by Bora Tusk. They were in his possession. And the only way to get one was to impress him. Inala managed to do that and hence was awarded the elixir. And now, many had felt the killing intent unleashed by Risha. So, they calmly observed the conversing duo. If Risha were to unjustly steal the elixir, it would undermine Bora Tusk's authority. When that happened, they would give him a swift death. Risha too understood it, which was why he dare not make a move on Inala. This isn't the time to let my emotions get the best of me. Wash my neck for what? Inala snorted exasperatedly in worry, are you threatening me about a fair trade? Did I force you to buy it? Didn't you accept the proposal? Why are you acting as if I stole your resources? Inala unleashed a flurry of arguments. He had 6 years' experience in being a keyboard warrior. Engaging in arguments was his speciality, as all keyboard warriors did. Arguments weren't a speciality of Sumatra, since after a couple of words of disagreement, it would usually lead to an exchange of death blows. Therefore, people weren't trained in the art of fighting with words, including Risha. Hearing Inala's words, Risha was stunned, unable to make a comeback argument. Grabbing the offered bone sphere, Inala infused his prana into it, immediately sensing a stream of information enter his mind and solidify into the skill of toxin refinement. He observed the skill's effect. Just as the novel stated, this skill can only be used on living creatures. It isn't efficient to perform on dead pranic beasts. Using it on a dead pranic beast was inefficient as the consumed prana was more than the effects of the tonic created. There was no benefit in doing so. But that didn't mean he shouldn't attempt it once. Mystic Bone Art, Toxin Refinement. Inala pushed his rugged bone sphere into the mouth of a mud viper corpse and activated the skill. Prana flowed out of the rugged bone sphere, absorbed the toxins from the mud viper's venom sac, and began the refinement. His prana was fully expended as Inala brought out his rugged bone sphere. Absorbed in it was a couple milliliters of the mud viper tonic. What is the meaning of this? Risha glared at the rugged bone sphere hovering before his face. You don't trust me. Nope, Inala said in confidence, so, test it out for me, will you? Fine. Risha grumbled and consumed the 2 milliliters. Nothing unusual happened to him, proving the authenticity of the skill. There, happy. There doesn't seem to be any signs of tampering done to the skill. He could have also done so to make side effects appear after a long duration or when a large amount is consumed. As Inala had no knowledge of the toxin refinement skill, even if it had been tampered with, he wouldn't know. Therefore, it was best to test its effects. Inala observed from the corner of his eyes the gazes of the reincarnates. They intended to make a deal with him to benefit from the toxin refinement skill. I have the perfect guinea pigs. Now, the method to gain 40 prana. Inala smiled and extended his hand. Never, Risha glared, I'll help you absorb it, but I'm never giving you the method. What to do? Inala sported an expression of false worry, I was expecting the method. You can't force me to reveal myself defenselessly to you, right? I don't trust you, after all. Risha intended to help Inala in absorbing the elixir by infusing his prana into the latter. The reason he accepted was simple. He had methods to forcefully dominate an opponent's prana. The moment Inala allows Risha to guide his prana, his life and death would fall under the control of Risha. Too bad, Risha. I know your character well enough to know what you'll attempt here. But you don't know me, and that gives me the advantage in this trade. This was why he cleverly asked for the toxin refinement skill first. And only after learning it did he ask for the method to increase the effectiveness of the elixir. If he revealed that beforehand, Risha wouldn't have accepted the deal. But now, Risha had no other choice. He was halfway across the bridge. He had yet to gain the elixir, but he had already given out the toxin refinement skill. If he backed out now, he'll fall into the abyss. The loss he suffered would come to haunt him for a long time. Well, I feel bad for you. So, I'll give you the entire vial of elixir. As Risha was dangling on the shaky bridge, a path of hope lit up in the form of Inala. In return, Inala smiled, teach me the method. The full elixir. Risha's anger wavered. With it, he would cross 100 prana. That was the same as graduating from the academy. He would gain the qualifications to obtain tremendous power. Moreover, it will allow me to train and consolidate my strength before the first major disaster. This time, I'll be able to fully inherit the power of an Empyrean tusk. Fine, his anger vanished automatically. It didn't matter if he suffered a loss here. No, it wasn't even a loss. With the elixir, he was saving a year's worth of time. It would allow him to become many times stronger than his past life self. Swear it on your parents that both the methods you gave me haven't been tampered with. Inala extended his hand to give the elixir but suddenly retracted it. Risha felt the urge to kill Inala once again, you know I'm an orphan. That kind of oath. But you respect them, right? Inala spoke as if it was natural, even if they aren't there, a son would never disrespect his parents. So, an oath taken on their name is the most trustworthy. It wasn't absolute, as there were plenty of people that would make empty promises, but not Risha, especially on his parents. After all, they were alive. He was aware of that. And he indeed respected them the most, for they sacrificed their lives just for his sake. Therefore, if he made an oath in their name, then it was guaranteed to be the absolute truth. "You're a despicable guy, you know." Risha made an oath in the name of his parents and inscribed the method on his bone sphere before throwing it to Inala. Am I, really? You sure?" Inala acted innocent as he gave away the elixir and absorbed the method. The related knowledge condensed in his mind, allowing him to mentally leap in joy. Mystic Bone Art, Elixir Condensation. Chapter 9. Live as a cultivator. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Inala's original plan was to use his contribution, in successfully closing the shelter's entrance, to request Granny Oyo's help. When the elites arrived to rescue the students, they would obviously reward him. But, things went above his expectations when Bora Tusk made an appearance and rewarded him with an elixir. That forced him to swiftly change his plans. There was no guarantee that a plan might work on Sumatra unless one was aware of all variables. Therefore, the moment there was the slightest change, one would need to quickly incorporate that change into their plans. That was Inala's motto once he realized he was being reincarnated into this treacherous world. So, once he gained an elixir, his plans adapted accordingly. Not for a moment did he plan to consume it. After all, he was afflicted by the fragment disease. Even if he raised his prana values, it would plummet over time. Prana was a fusion of the energies of the soul, mind, and body. In his case, his body was a mess. Therefore, every time his bones crack, his prana would be permanently consumed to repair the damage. Without prana, even the expansion and contraction of his lungs when he breathed was enough to shatter his ribcage and kill him. Hence, consuming the elixir at this point was useless. His first priority would be to get used to prana and train in it. As his prana values increase by training and plummet through bone damage, he would gain experience in preserving his prana. Risha had enough experience, thanks to his past life, to preserve his prana when his bones crack. Therefore, he had the confidence to maintain his prana values without any loss after consuming the elixir. Inala had made the plan keeping all this in mind. Thankfully, he succeeded. His knowledge of the Sumatra chronicles was only theoretical. He knew the effects of the various skills but had no idea how they functioned. In the novel, all it was mentioned was that the toxin refinement skill turned a toxin into a tonic. That gave zero knowledge about the actual process. Now, he possessed the skill, and with it came the relevant knowledge. As long as he studied it, he would be able to fill up his lacking practical knowledge. In the long run, that would help him survive with greater success. Since his transaction with Risha was completed, Inala got up and groaned in pain while he walked towards Greha. The latter had crawled out of the roll of mud vipers by now. Seeing his approach, Greha flashed an amicable smile. "Share the rewards with me, will you? I sold it to Risha." Saying so, Inala crouched to pick up a mud viper. Greha caught his hand, preventing him from carrying the mud viper. "That's mine." "I knocked this one out," Inala said, not budging an inch. "You claimed full contribution in closing the entrance. In that vein of thought, I'm claiming these 3 mud vipers." Greha still maintained his amicable smile. "Let go." Inala grumbled. "You let go," Greha laughed. The duo stared at each other for a few seconds before Inala proposed, "I'll give you 2 liters of mud viper tonic. You gained that method from Risha, huh?" Greha's smile widened in response. "Teach it to me." "You know I can't." Inala acted like he was helpless. "I haven't reached high enough proficiency in the mystic bone art to inscribe information in a piece of bone. Through the mystic bone art, a mammoth clansman could inscribe a vast sea of knowledge within a small piece of bone. Risha had done that to give Inala the skills of toxin refinement and elixir condensation. Moreover, Once the transfer of knowledge was completed, the information within the bone sphere vanished automatically. That needed an even higher application of mystic bone art than simply inscribing information into a piece of bone. Obviously, Inala could do neither of that. He could only shrug in response, if you want it that badly, you can ask the source to teach it to you. Huh, Greha laughed wryly. That would be a death sentence. Oraka tried to forcefully acquaint with Risha and ended up being captured by the mud vipers. He was probably dead by now. Greha intended to surpass the regressor, but this was too early to do so. Only something like an elixir gave one the right to deal with the regressor, and that only at this early in the game. In the future, Risha would drink elixirs like it was water. Greha had no tools or ability in his arsenal that gave him an edge over Risha. So, transacting with the regressor was impossible. If he was careless and triggered the latter, he might be killed instead. In the end, he had to give in to Inala's demands, give me 10 liters. I'll give you 4, Inala argued. I won't go below 8. Greha increased the strength in his grip, we could be here all day. I don't mind. Fine, 8 liters it is. Inala relented in the end. He didn't have a choice. 1 liter of the mud viper tonic increased prana by 10, not to mention suppressing the effects of the fragment disease. It will take forever to refine 8 liters. Even if Greha cooperated, they only had 3 alive mud vipers in their possession. It was apparent Greha intended to rely on Inala to raise his prana values safely. I'll visit you every time my mud vipers refill their venom sac. Saying so, Greha dragged his 2 mud vipers and exited the shelter. It seems he has a plan regarding them. Inala thought. He had no idea about what went on in Greha's mind though. Sumatra Chronicles was as detailed as possible. Even after spending 6 years pondering about what-if scenarios in the novel's setting during his daydreaming sessions, Inala had only mapped out some methods that he felt would grant him an advantage if he were to ever be in that world, something all ardent readers did. Greha might have figured out a method of his own too. That's a definite possibility. There was a reason us 6 were picked for this. Once he exited the shelter, Inala noticed a massive pile of mud viper corpses on the open grounds in the academy. The pile reached a height surpassing 100 meters. The cultivators were working on compressing them into massive meatballs, each 40 to 50 meters in diameter. They would be fed to the Empyrean tusk. The Empyrean tusk wasn't just a pranic beast, its body was an entire ecosystem, with its own food generation. The food generated by the Empyrean tusk in its belly was what the mammoth clansmen consumed. They consumed only that, for this food perfectly complemented their mystic bone art. It was stated that the ancestor of the mammoth clan could communicate with the Empyrean tusks. And jointly, they created the mystic bone art. From then on, the descendants of the mammoth clan lived on the Empyrean tusks in a symbiotic relationship with each other. There's a lot to take in. I really am in Sumatra. Inala stared up and observed massive floating planets far up in the sky. No one knew what lay in there. There didn't exist any pranic beast in Sumatra continent capable of flight, neither were cultivators. Therefore, the secrets of those celestial bodies observable from throughout Sumatra continent remained a mystery, until the end of the novel. Fucking author. I was looking forward to the arc where Risha would explore those worlds. Inala climbed the tallest building in the academy and stared out from there, able to see the head of his Empyrean tusk, partially covered by clouds. Slowly, heavy steps, one after another, with its body remaining perfectly horizontal throughout the motion to the extent the mammoth clan oftentimes forgot they were on a moving pranic beast. He stared at the forest beyond the Empyrean tusk. Lush greenery, covered with mounds, and mud vipers scuttling within in the billions. Danger existed everywhere. That was Sumatra. He was finally able to take in the splendor of a cultivation world. Despite its treacherous nature, it allowed him to live his dream. As a cultivator. Chapter 10. Spirit container. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Academy of Refinement, Dorm of the Abandoned. It was a dorm for the orphan students to live in. Since they don't have a family, they wouldn't have a house in the clan. As the clan rules state, all houses belong to the Mammoth clan. A cultivator only lives in the house fit for his strength and based on his contribution to the clan. Even the settlement leader was no exception. Therefore, the orphans were accommodated within the academy itself. But the clan seriously called it the Dorm of the Abandoned. They had no chill in such matters. In a room on the topmost floor of the dorm was Inala. He had been living here for the past month. The topmost floor was risky to be in, as if any attacks were to happen, this was the farthest away from a shelter. It was also situated in the least guarded region. But conversely, the room was also the largest. It spanned an area of 40 square meters, the biggest one could find in the academy. The rooms of the other students just consisted enough area to lay down the mattress and sleep. The risks were well worth the area, hence Inala daringly shifted to this room. Barely succeeded, phew. He exhaled softly as he stared at a large rectangular board of hardened mud. The surface was smooth and even had a glossy sheen to it. Sprawled on the floor next to it was an unconscious mud viper. It had spat out mud today too, forced to do so by Inala after its weakness had been taken advantage of. After feeding it 2 balls of meatballs produced exclusively by the Empyrean tusk, Inala tied it up once again. Next to him was a bunch of pottery, all made from the mud released by the mud viper. His control over prana was severely lacking. Therefore, to raise his proficiency, he began to make pottery. By this point, he had adapted to the cultivation world and stabilized his knowledge with some experience. There existed 4 cultivation stages in Sumatra: spirit, body, life, and transcendence. The stage of transcendence was only briefly mentioned towards the end of the novel, so it wasn't something to think about. If not for the fucking author that killed the spirit was the earliest stage on the road of cultivation. It focused on the refinement of the cultivator's mind and soul. In Sumatra, every human was born a cultivator without exception. And at birth, they possessed 1 prana. Those with talent were born with more prana. There were many cultivation techniques to train prana, graded accordingly to their effectiveness. The cultivation technique of the Mammoth clan belonged at the top of Sumatra. Just accumulating prana wasn't enough to cultivate. One's spirit must be strong enough to create containers that can hold prana stably in the body. As prana's nature, composed of mind, soul, and body, of existence, it can only be contained in a vessel where the 3 elements converge. That was a spirit container. For every unit of prana, a spirit container needs to be created. Without a container, even if one gains prana and stores it in the body, at the slightest mishap, the prana would leak. The mishap can even be something minor like being rattled emotionally. That was enough if the spirit container wasn't strong enough. The only way to strengthen it was through repeated, focused, and dedicated practice, especially on activities that could strain one's mind to the extreme. By training the mind, body, and prana repeatedly, the spirit container is strengthened. That was the essence of cultivation during the spirit stage. It was why Inala multitasked in his pottery sessions. It trained all fronts with spectacular efficiency. Moreover, pottery had other uses too, monetary ones. In the spirit stage, a cultivator could refine and control an object as if it was an extension of their body. Cultivators in the Mammoth clan refined and controlled bones. The ability was similar to psychokinesis and decently lethal. By refining a piece of bone, Inala was imprinting his spirit into it, thereby able to control it. The refined object would become the cultivator's exclusive spirit weapon. Everyone only used 1 spirit weapon to fight, as the effectiveness of the ability dropped exponentially when more than 1 spirit weapon was controlled at the same time. One would reach the peak of the spirit stage after accumulating 100 prana. But the greater the prana in your body, the greater the strain on your spirit containers. For, spirit containers were connected to the body. And the body's exertion actually affected them. For Inala, even crossing 40 prana would be dangerous. It would put too much pressure on his body. Coupled with his condition, his spirit containers might collapse automatically, causing the stored prana to be wasted. This was why he didn't consume the elixir. He wouldn't even be able to handle the pressure, and by the next day, his prana values might drop to the single digits. The only way to offset the risk was to understand the inner mechanics of spirit containers and the effect fragment disease had on them. With a complete understanding, Inala would be able to focus the damage onto one spirit container alone. Thereby, even when it breaks, all he would lose is one prana. That wasn't hard to recover. When a mammoth clansman accumulates 100 prana and stabilizes their spirit containers, they would reach the zenith of the spirit stage. Following that, once they fused the 100 spirit containers into a single, stable spirit container, they would enter the body stage. This was where the fun started. Inala's greatest plan to surpass Risha lay here. Once they reached the body stage, a mammoth clansman would capture a pranic beast egg and begin refining it. The shell of the egg fell under the influence of the mystic bone art, including the contents within. Hence, it could be refined. Once the egg is fully refined, it will fuse with the spirit container, thereby becoming one with the mammoth clansman, allowing them to transform into the said pranic beast. They gain all powers of the pranic beast, including its prana capacity. Innately, a human spirit container can only withstand 100 prana. But after this fusion process, the cultivator's spirit container becomes the pranic beast itself, gaining its characteristics, thereby being able to store more prana. But there was a trick here. Pranic beasts were divided into grades of iron, silver, gold, and mystic. Each grade was then subdivided into beginner, intermediate, advanced, and expert. Mud vipers were classified as beginner iron grade pranic beasts, the lowest of the low. At maturity, they held a maximum of 300 prana. An intermediate iron grade pranic beast held prana between 300 and 600, and so on. An expert gold grade pranic beast like the Empyrean tusk at maturity holds around 7200 to 8400 prana. They weren't even in the same dimension of comparison. And in Sumatra chronicles, Risha becomes an Empyrean tusk, attaining unmatchable power. But even he died to the boar king. During the fourth major disaster, the mammoth clan was annihilated. Therefore, to survive, sheer strength wouldn't be sufficient. Picking a pranic beast with a versatile surviving nature was necessary. Inala already had his choice in mind. To prepare for that, he first needed to raise his value to the clan. Only then would he be granted a house to live in after graduation. And to attain his desired pranic beast egg, he had to get a certain house no matter the cost. The only way to do that was to take advantage of his previous life's skills. And, done. Inala grinned as he stared at a lifelike mud sculpture.